For those who don't like know you or have had you as a professor, would you be able to give us a brief introduction about yourself?
Sure. So first, I'd like to say that I had a wonderful career as a journalist. It was my first career. It lasted about 20 years. During that time, I was working for Voice of America. I reported on politics and national news out of Washington, and that included the White House. So it certainly prepared me for a lot of political and other journalism that I would pursue later. But then I spent a lot of time overseas. I was in some European countries, sort of what they used to call as a fireman, fire person, sort of parachuting in. And then I became the bureau chief for Southern Africa, which was about a dozen countries, and I was based in South Africa. And this was starting in mid-1984. So it was really during the height of the beginning of the anti-apartheid protests. I spent a lot of time in South Africa. I was there when Nelson Mandela walked out of prison. I was able to interview him a few days later. It was certainly one of the highlights of my career. I came back to Washington for a few years and then went back to South Africa to cover the end of apartheid and the democratic elections. So I really can say that I had a great deal of experience in foreign reporting. I covered war, I covered civil war, humanitarian crises, most of all, really getting to know some wonderful, wonderful people. Then after that, I pivoted to the communication field. I spent about 7 years in the private sector. We parted company, and I then joined the World Bank in Southern Africa as their regional communications officer. Mostly I had the opportunity to report on development issues and outcomes. It was great. I worked with civil society, I worked with the media, and I really learned so much about situations that I really hadn't learned enough about before. It taught me a lot about people. It taught me a lot about different cultures, again, about humanitarian issues, and I feel that that was really important. Then I came back to Washington. I was still with the World Bank, but in 2016, we parted company, and I came to Mason as an adjunct in journalism, and I joined Mason full-time as an instructor in the fall of 2019.
You're here. I remember in class, we always loved, like my class loved asking you so many questions. Like we were so excited. I remember during the end of class, you gave us a chance to ask you questions.
Yeah,
And I
I
think you
try.
taught us so much too, like a lot.
Well, thank you. I try to keep my private and my sort of career life out of my teaching, but certainly it's informed my teaching, especially my career. And
Yeah.
when I can, I use elements to illustrate something.
Yeah.
But I try not to make me the sort of focal point of the
Yeah.
class.
It's helped
I
like
leave
when
it
we
to the
were
end.
learning about like writing, it helped so much, and interviewing, and it really, yeah, that one was important. I like that. So
Well,
let's
that's
go.
great to know. I'm still enjoying teaching it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go into the next question. So, what is political journalism and what is the main role or duty political journalists serve?
Okay. And that's a really important question. I think, you know, in general, let's just say that the purpose of journalism is to shine a light on issues, right? Especially if those issues need some sort of attention or focus. So with that in mind, the purpose of political journalism really is to serve the community. and to give people information that they need to participate in civic affairs, right? To participate in essentially making decisions about their daily lives. Political reporting covers government, from state to local to national, governance issues. Political journalists cover campaigns. And really, political journalists as members of the Fourth Estate, I think they play a very important role. They serve as the watchdogs to report the truth, to report facts, and to help assure honest governance and campaigns. They really should be focusing their coverage on the most important and pressing issues for society. And during an election period like we have now, they really need to dig deep and report on issues, not just the daily horse race. We have a tendency to want to get into the polling and the surveys and who's ahead and who's behind. But really what's most important for political journalists is to offer perspective, not opinion. They should be looking at complex issues and ways to understand and interpret those issues for their readers or their viewers. And that's really what political journalism is so much about.
Yeah. That was I like that. You covered everything. Okay, let's see. So when looking at an election year, do you think political journalists have an impact on the election or the outcome of it?
Oh, absolutely, indeed they do. Perhaps not what people might assume, but it's the reason that political journalists should adhere to reporting that is defensible and rigorous and transparent, right?
Yeah.
So again, theirs is not the job of expressing opinion. That should really be left to the so-called pundits, the people who write the op-ed pages. The journalists themselves should be committed to reporting the truth and the facts, and to be able to show verification of that through very credible sources. And the bottom line really is for people who are voting to be able to make their own decisions based on solid and factual reporting. So I'm not talking about the pundits, and there's really a big difference between those who are writing the op-eds and some of the anchors that we might see on cable news. You know, they are not really journalists whose brief it is to report the truth. That is the job of political journalists, especially to report the truth and the facts as far as possible, to chronicle the issues, to offer informed suggestions through others who are knowledgeable. So
yeah,
that's really the primary impact that they would have, is how readers and viewers can relate to what they are covering.
Yeah, and I think it's important as like a reader, reading the articles or the media, to always be cautious and like make sure, they have those credible sources too.
Well, that's absolutely key. And unfortunately, we've seen so much partisanship, especially over the last number of years. And it's reflected in certain newspapers that, let's face it, some which have been bought by other organizations or outlets with political agendas, and this gets translated. So viewers, readers have to be really, really careful and make sure they're getting their news from reputable sources. It's the most important thing.
Yeah, especially like on social media too. I know on Facebook especially, it's quick for someone to share without even clicking the actual article. And it could, I remember someone shared an article and it was 2017. I was like, are you not opening? Are you guys not reading it? And so,
yeah, well, Angie, because I know that you're also quite a social media expert. This stuff reverberates around the world. Millions can read a tweet or open a Facebook page or an Instagram instantly. So absolutely,
Yeah.
we really have to be careful.
Yeah. And so for the next question, kind of ties in as well, the topic of fake news, which has been a very popular discussion in the past couple of years. Can you briefly talk about that subject and in regards to political journalism?
Sure. And certainly social media comes into this too. But look,
Yeah.
let's be very clear. Fake news is nothing new. I mean, we can go
Yeah.
back in history even to ancient times, right? There's been rumor, gossip, and just plain lies that leaders and
Yeah.
politicians have used to win support. So that in and of itself shouldn't surprise anybody. It's taken on a slightly different meaning in recent years, especially when politicians don't like what journalists are reporting, and then they're calling it fake,
Yeah.
or they're labeled journalists the enemy of the people. This is a different kind of issue and has more danger to it because it's had a lot of repercussions. Certainly in this country, where people now are wondering, gee, should I be able to trust journalists anymore? And the answer is yes, they should, as long as they are the reputable, credible, trained journalists. But also in other countries where we've seen some leaders using the whole fake news sort of enemy of the people mantra against their own journalists. And this has caused a lot of harm, right? We have to be very careful because, you know, freedom of information is very important, and having a free press is very important. So one needs to be mindful of that. But I want to make another point here. One thing is fake news, but I think it's really just as important, if not even more so, to speak about misinformation and disinformation, especially the latter. We've seen a lot of foreign actors trying to weaponize disinformation, especially through social media, right, to impact voters in elections. We've seen that happen. You know, Facebook can show ads of different things that are up there, and you can't always tell the difference between the one that's real and the one that is sowing disinformation, and that's trying to put a different message across that is a much more partisan or even some kind of hate kind of a message. We've seen disinformation promoted by some of the more partisan news outlets, right? Or the partisan political pundits. And a lot of people believe that they're getting news, but they're not getting news. They're just still getting more misinformation and disinformation, because if you really started to fact check a lot of what goes on, you wouldn't find that there is any basis to it, right? There are no facts there, but it still gets perpetuated. And that's a particularly dangerous situation because, again, especially with social media, it reverberates instantly, millions and millions of people. So I really want to be clear. There have been other things too that have been contributing to the polarization. It's not just the misinformation, disinformation, and other so-called fake news. There's truth and there's lies, right?
Yeah.
But journalists and political journalists need to continue to keep examining other important issues that are causing ructions in the country. We need to look at race and ethnicity, right? Poverty and economics, gender, religion, all of these things require a spotlight.
Yeah, that's very important. Yeah. I mean, sometimes I'll go on Twitter and someone from another country will be like, oh, nobody's talking about this topic. Like, why is nobody talking about this? And, you know, It's like, wow, I didn't even know that was going on in the world right now.
Well, and that can become an issue. Sometimes it should be something that's discussed, and other
Mhm.
times it may be something that's not actually real
That's
and
true.
shouldn't.
That's when
And
the
it's
misinformation comes as well.
right. So it's
Yeah.
important to interrogate your sources, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So aside from fake news, we'll go in with your journalism career. So you now teach classes on political journalism. How do you think the election has impacted teaching political journalism? And
Yeah, well, there's no doubt that this has been a really unconventional and contentious election period. And this has all been compounded by COVID-19 and the pandemic.
yeah.
So it has been a most interesting and sometimes exhausting time to teach political journalism. Um, I've never seen such entrenched partisanship um, in this country, and it's so divided people. And yeah, we have to discuss that in class. Um, we certainly maintain civil discourse in the classroom. I believe that everyone and anyone who wants to speak up about an issue can and should be able to do so without any fear of being shouted down. Okay, we're all online, but nonetheless, I want people to raise their points of view. A lot of students use the chat button, which is
Mhm.
absolutely fine. Maybe it helps them feel a little bit more distant or in a sense protected, whatever makes them feel, you know, okay. But the issues themselves are important. And it's also important for students and the journalists, and most of the students are preparing to be journalists or are hoping to be journalists. Some of them are working for the Fourth Estate, Mason's own student newspaper, which is a fabulous thing. They are writing news reports. They are writing news analysis that looks at a specific down ballot election that they're covering through the semester. They're working in real time. Specifically, they're not covering the presidential election.
Yeah.
We discussed that as a class. And we did that. I did that for some
Mhm.
obvious reasons. But while they're doing this reporting, it's been really important for them to learn how to reach out to sources, do those interviews, and build those credible sources to bring perspective into the reports that they're doing. And then to remember that there's always at least another side. Now, there's been a lot of arguments over objectivity and both sidesism and all of that. But for the purposes of my class, I do want the students to understand that it isn't one-sided. There are other sides. They need to bring in the other points of view. I'm not saying they always have to have equal weight. That's not necessarily the objective of the exercise, but they have to be represented so that their readers will understand that there are various points of view, and can make their own informed decisions.
Yeah.
I know reporting is so difficult right now because of the pandemic. Reporters everywhere are facing the same situation, but even our students have been able to be extremely resourceful. They have followed all the recommended health procedures to get their information. They've done a lot through Zoom,
Zoom, yeah.
through using Facebook chat, whatever, masked up, you know,
Yeah.
kept their distance, and even using just the old-fashioned phone,
Yeah.
even though these days it's a smart one. Um,
Yeah.
but really, I commend them for it because it's a tough time and they're doing a great job.
Yeah. And thankfully we have social media and technology now because I mean everybody has adjusted to Instagram Live, Facebook Live, Zoom. And so we're really fortunate to actually have technology like this to even be successful in a pandemic as well.
Yeah. And that's the upside of the
Yeah.
social media, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's always going to be
Mm-hmm.
another side in
Yeah.
the same vein, right?
Yeah. And I think it's also, to add on what you were saying, it's also important for everyone to be open-minded and always listen to other sides and perspectives as well.
Absolutely. We're not going to learn to appreciate and respect one another if we don't hear one another. It's
Yeah.
very important to listen and to read different perspectives.
Yeah.
People really should be reading widely.
Yeah. Exactly. Alrighty, so we'll close off the last question for the viewers watching this after it's uploaded. So do you have any suggestions for how they can best stay informed during a year such as this, while um, potentially, receiving and consuming misleading information, and like how
Yeah,
to
and
avoid it as well?
thank you. That's a really important question. And I think it goes back to what we were just talking about. Everybody should read widely, get different viewpoints from reputable news sources. Don't rely on one source of information. Um, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, they aren't news agencies. They're not media outlets. They're clearinghouses in a way for anyone's and everyone's opinions. So, do they have an important role to play? Yeah, and we've discussed that
Yeah.
and noted it. And certainly in countries where people may not even have so much access to information as we do in this country, they do have an important role to play. But they can also feed that beast of misinformation and disinformation. And that just causes more anxiety and exhaustion. You know, it's been an exhausting election season, and I'm sure our viewers realize that come election night, we may not have all the answers,
Yeah.
and we probably won't even have all the votes counted, and we might
Yeah.
not immediately know the outcome of the election. But that's okay, because
Yeah.
that's how the democratic system works in this country. The system allows all votes cast in accordance with somebody's, with your state's governing laws to be counted, and that could take some time. So I would just say to viewers, again, look at a variety of sources over the next several days, weeks, months. Continue to consume a lot of different sources so that you feel that you're getting a good sense of what's really out there, and listen and hear what people are saying, and try to appreciate that we are all in this together, and we have to be patient. It's going to take patience, but hopefully we'll get through the election and the election results, and everything else will fall into place.
Yes, yes. Very true. And I remember it was super important. We would have conversations before class about the news. And I remember he said it was important to always making sure to watch not just one news outlet and channels, a various amount. And I've like done that now, and I think it's super important.
Listen, it's the most important thing. We all have to get out of our comfort zones
Yep.
and understand what others are saying. How can we have our viewpoints and argue intelligently if we don't understand what the other point of view is?
Yeah.
And we can have disagreements,
Yeah.
but let's discuss it. Let's do it in a nicer way, rather than the kind of exhausting way that we seem to be having right now. It just doesn't, it's not productive.
Nope. Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Professor. I've had this lovely conversation with you, and it was nice speaking with you again. Do you have anything to conclude or?
No, I really think that, again, it's a tough time. And we just all have to be patient, understanding, and realize that we can all have different points of view, but that doesn't mean that we can't get along.
Yeah, that's very important. Very important. Well, thank you so much for your time
Thank
and
you, Angie.
thank you. I hope
Wish
you
you the
have,
best of luck.